This is the Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 27.
Go flying. And if there's something that you've always wanted to do, go and do it. Go and do that formation endorsement, or go and do a session of spins with an instructor, or go and do that scenic flight over some beautiful part of the country that you've always wanted to see. Do those things that you can only do in a little aeroplane.
Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson. Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm really excited to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, Jeremy Robertson. Welcome to the show, Jeremy. Are you ready to inspire today?
Absolutely, Marvin.
Excellent. Let's go. Jeremy Robertson started flying at the age of 15 in Canberra, Australia, completing his PPL at the end of high school and gaining his commercial licenses via the University of New South Wales Bachelor of Aviation program. Jeremy has worked as a flying instructor, bush pilot and airline pilot, accumulating 7,500 flying hours across aircraft ranging from ultralights to Boeing 747s before a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes in 2010 ended his commercial flying career. Jeremy has recently graduated from the University of Sydney with a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, and is currently working as a junior doctor and aiming for a career in general practice and aerospace medicine. Now holding a unrestricted Class 2 medical, Jeremy continues to instruct at his local ultralight club, maintains a current multi-engine instrument rating, and will fly anything that's put in front of him. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, just a brief overview of what sounds like a really interesting bio there. Can you take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself personally, where you're from, and before we jump deeper into your journey, I've touched on it a bit there, but can you give us just a brief high-level overview of what you're doing aviation-wise right now?
Well, Marvin, as you said, I started life in Canberra, Australia, but left Canberra at the end of high school to move to Sydney. And apart from that brief stint of bush flying, I've spent my whole life living in Sydney. And aviation-wise, at the moment, I'm working casually as a flying instructor for my little ultralight club. And just struggling, I guess, to maintain recency for my instrument rating and flying privately.
Fantastic. Wow, really excited to go deeper into your journey there. Sounds like you had a significant twist in your story. But before we jump into that, every story does have to start somewhere. So you started flying at 15, so tell us how you first got involved with flying in the first place.
Well, it all started because halfway through high school, I failed a career suitability test that my local high school careers advisor had. It was a bank of 200 questions that we had to answer, and it spat out a graph telling us what career areas we were most suited to. And my result was that I was not suitable for any career.
Anything.
And I just remember, yeah, that's right. I just remember getting this polite note in my locker from the careers advisor saying, "Jeremy, we need to talk about your test results." And I guess the test actually worked because it forced me to think about actually what I was interested in. And of all the questions that the test asked me, the only one that I indicated a small amount of interest in was flying helicopters for the Army. There was no question, do you want to be an airline pilot? And if that had been on there, I think, that would have indicated what my career interest was.
Yeah.
And that sort of set me off in an interesting direction. I was at a private boys' school at the time, and I found one of the local high schools in Canberra that offered private pilot license theory subjects as a high school subject. So I convinced my parents somehow to let me change schools from a private school to a public school, and that the money they saved in doing that they could spend on flying lessons instead.
Fabulous.
It was quite a hard sell, but somehow they agreed, and so I started flying training towards my PPL in my second last year of high school. So for the last 2 years of high school, I flew once a week, once a fortnight, and by the end of high school, I had my private license.
I love that you had to raise a business case with your parents to encourage them to prove that your idea was a good one and to switch schools. I'm interested in how it seems, I've had a few Australian and New Zealand guests on the show, how pro flying and pro aviation Australia and I guess New Zealand is in terms of teaching or at least having flying training as part of general syllabus, for you in high school and obviously in university as well. Why is that?
It was certainly a very unique thing when I was at high school. That was in the early 90s. I don't remember knowing of too many other high schools elsewhere in Australia that did a similar thing. But certainly nowadays, I know that it's more common. There are more options to get involved in aviation earlier in your schooling career. So I think it just comes down to Australia and New Zealand having such a long-standing history with aviation. It's such an integral part of the exploration of the country, and also especially in Australia, given the vast distances involved, it's still a very important component of how Outback Australia runs.
Yeah. Oh, it's very interesting. I'm just curious, what other occupations were on that list, on that suitability test? That's kind of funny.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't remember. Of those 200 questions, the only one I remember is that flying helicopters for the Army, because I guess that must have been the only question that piqued some interest. Yeah. All of the other jobs must have just sounded dead boring to me.
Yeah, okay. So you finished your PPL at high school, flying once a week. So tell us about your training. How did you find the training, and what was it like within the schooling system? How did it all fit in together?
I loved doing the theory subjects at high school. It was the lesson that I looked forward to each week, and having half a dozen other students, because it was quite a small class, all interested in the same thing, was really great. And the flying training itself, again, it was something that I looked forward to every weekend. And I remember my mum telling me that I would come home from my lessons and I would just crash out for the afternoon and sleep for the rest of the day. Yeah. So it was obviously a very mentally draining experience for me. And to be honest, it probably kept me on the straight and narrow, because I was so focused on going flying on the weekend that I wasn't going out and partying with my mates. So it probably improved my behaviour through high school as well, I'd have to say.
Yeah, there's something to say about being focused on one particular activity or a passion to keep you on the straight and narrow. So it's probably a good thing. Your parents must have benefited from that as well.
Absolutely.
So obviously you're 15 years old. There's various changes going on in your life. You're a teenager. How did you find your training? And let's talk about challenges now. What did you find challenging the most out of your PPL training?
Probably my PPL and my CPL training. The thing I struggled with the most was forced landings. I remember having to go and do an additional lesson with the chief flying instructor on forced landings, and he came to the conclusion that I was just wildly inconsistent. So some forced landings would be great, others would be a complete dog's breakfast. And I remember him clearly saying that he, if I was consistently bad, he could fix that because he would know what the problem was. But I was so inconsistent that he didn't know where to start. I can't remember what the solution to it was, but it clearly got fixed because I passed my license tests eventually. But I definitely remember struggling with forced landings.
Okay, so that's one part. I remember myself, a little story where I had different instructors, and this particular instructor wasn't one of those ones that just pulled the throttle and said, land. This one said, you pull the throttle when you find a suitable field. So I was flying around and it was like, the engine was going and I was looking for this field, and he pull the throttle when you're ready. And it went on for about 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden, pulled the throttle, and then all of a sudden my senses came into action, and then I found that field, that runaway looking field. But yeah, it was funny where it's like self-preservation thing. I just couldn't. It's like I couldn't pull the throttle. It was really strange. But
absolutely. Yeah, I don't think I would have pulled the throttle until I was on short final at a runway if I'd been given that option.
Exactly. Excellent. Okay, so forced landings was a challenge. And what else? How did you get on? You're obviously a student at the time. So how did you find the theory element of the flying training?
I find it came quite naturally because as a high school student, I had an interest in maths and physics anyway. So that, the mechanical side of it wasn't a problem. My father's an old car nut, so I sort of grew up in the garage with him doing up old MGs.
Yeah.
So the practical element of engines wasn't a problem either. And the navigation theory, I have a real love for navigation and maps, so I really enjoyed the theory behind learning how to navigate. And as I said, those classes, as compared to my other high school subjects, the aviation theory classes were a highlight. So I didn't struggle with any motivation to study for those at all.
Yeah, fabulous. That sounds great. So moving on from high school then, was it straight from high school, straight into university?
Yes, it's probably one of my few life regrets that I didn't take a gap year and go travelling. But straight to university, I moved to Sydney and I lived on campus at a residential college. And this is probably the first time where I struggled with academic subjects because suddenly I was away from home, living in a co-ed college with 130 other students. And, the world opened up to me. So I distinctly remember calculating exactly how many marks I needed to scrape through maths and physics at the end of year exams in first year. And that was a real struggle. Again, the aviation subjects weren't a problem, but it was, the more dry academic subjects I struggled with.
Yeah, I think as well, say for example, when you set your targets so low, sometimes you're in danger of actually hitting those low targets rather than trying to aim high and sort of like seeing where that takes you. So
yes, that's right. Well, I remember I got 50 for maths and 51 for physics in first year. So as my friend said, that's an engineer's pass. You had 1% too much effort in physics. But that's not really an ideal way to look at your academic results.
An engineer's pass. No offense to any engineers out there, right?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. So how was the flying training incorporated? Obviously, you're going for your commercial now within the university system. So give us a sort of an example of how, obviously, you've got the theory, but how did the flying training fit in with all this?
So it was incorporated in blocks around the academic work. So you would do a block of the university subjects on campus at university for a term or a semester, and then we would go out to Bankstown Airport, the largest GA airport in Sydney, and we'd spend a block of 6 or 8 weeks covering one component of your flying training. So we would go out and do all of our cross-country navigation for CPL, or we'd do all of our night flying for our night VFR rating. So it made the degree really enjoyable because you'd spend a few months on campus being a uni student, wearing shorts and a t-shirt and no shoes, enjoying the uni bar and that kind of stuff. And then you'd be spending a couple of months out at Bankstown Airport, hair neatly brushed in your uniform out there at 6 o'clock in the morning and flying airplanes. Yeah. So as soon as you sort of got sick of one aspect, you'd be back doing the other one. And I found that it really maintained my interest in the degree. So I really enjoyed that degree.
Yeah. I love the way that, it's a degree, rather than doing mechanical and electrical engineering, you were doing aviation. I think that's cool. That's from a personal point of view. So this whole system, the whole university degree program is geared up to, spit you out the other end as a qualified commercial pilot. What happens next?
Well, you spit out the end with your commercial license, your ATPL subjects, a night VFR rating, an instrument rating, and an instructor rating. So you're basically ready to go. And then it's that age-old challenge of trying to find the first job. I was very lucky that I got employed by the university as a flying instructor. So that sort of removed the challenge of getting that first job, whereas other mates of mine ended up moving out to the various corners of remote Australia, chasing jobs flying freight or tourists, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it was a 12-month contract. I worked for 12 months as a flying instructor. And then I followed my mates. That's when I went out to the bush and started my bush flying. Fantastic.
Well, the fact that your university employed you as an instructor is obviously a testament to, you must have been a grade A student. You had something to offer the other students.
Yeah, I'm not sure what, but I must have done something right.
Okay, and the move out to the bush. Obviously, your mates were out in the bush already, the far-flung corners of Australia. Were you sort of looking from afar, and were they having a better time than you, or what?
Oh, it's not that they were having a better time. It's just that I could see the value of that flying experience in my career progression. Yeah. You could see that people that had gone and done bush flying had progressed more quickly to larger and more complex airplanes as compared to someone who'd stayed in the major cities flying as an instructor.
Yeah.
Plus, I'm always keen for an adventure, and moving out to the middle of nowhere just seemed like a great adventure. So one of my good friends had moved up there to a little town called Kununurra, which is right up in the northwestern corner of Australia in an area known as the Kimberley, and it's far enough north that it's tropical. It gets a monsoon season, and it's very, very remote and sparsely populated. And he'd got a job up there just at the peak of the tourist season for a few months, and then he'd come back to Sydney when the tourist season ended, and that basically meant he was guaranteed a job at the start of the next year. So I just jumped in his ute. We packed up all of our life's belongings into the back of his ute, and we spent 3 days driving the 4,500 kilometres from Sydney to 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃.
Wow, that's far.
And and I just the routine was that you just hung around in town and introduced yourself to the chief pilots of the local operators, and tried to get yourself a job, at the pub or at the supermarket to keep yourself alive until a flying job appeared.
What was the competition like for jobs? Was it like loads of you guys hanging out? What was the competition like? Fierce?
Yeah, it was. I remember one of the owners of one of the flying companies saying he could just walk out the front of his office and kick a tree and a couple of pilots would fall out when he needed a new one.
That's not good, is it?
And it was. I seem to remember that there were about 40 new pilots put on the year that I joined up there, but there would have been double that in guys floating around town trying to get work. So it was pretty competitive, but I was lucky because I had that 1 year of instructing under my belt. So whereas a lot of the other guys had turned up there with a bare commercial license, 200 odd hours, I had about 500 hours. So I was lucky enough to be the first pilot employed as the tourist season kicked off and things got busy.
So tell us about your first job then. Go for it.
So my first job up in the bush was flying all the Cessna signals, basically. So the company had a whole bunch of Cessna 210s. They had a handful of 206s. They had one Cessna 207 and one Cessna 182. And during the dry season, the bulk of the work was tourist flying. So 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 is relatively close to this spectacular rock formation known as the 𝗂𝗶𝗹𝗃𝗃𝗃. And the bread and butter work was flying a plane load of tourists down to the bungles, fly a lap around the bungles, and then fly back to 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃. And that flight took 2 hours. So on a busy day, you'd just do 4 of those. And if you were unlucky, you would just do that day in and day out, which got a little bit monotonous.
Yeah.
So I think I have roughly 300 hours exclusively flying from 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 to the bungles and back. And that's not much in comparison to what some of my mates up there did.
Yeah.
But the other side of the work was all the remote area stuff. So there was a mail run. So I was the postie for an area pretty much the size probably of England. So once a week I would fill up a 206 with all the seats taken out of it, fill it up with mail bags and freight, and I'd fly to 9 little Aboriginal communities or cattle stations for the day, and it'd take me all day to do that run. So I'd land, drop off the mail bag, pick up whatever outgoing mail there was, and keep going. And every now and then you had a passenger as well that was transferring between stations or to or from one of the communities. And that was probably my favourite flight because I was out all day, so I didn't have to deal with the boss because I was airborne before he arrived.
Yeah.
And I was usually home either after he'd left or I just went straight home anyway. So, it was just me in the plane and all this remarkable scenery. The Kimberley is full of incredible natural scenery. Flying around it was great. It's just great.
In terms of 300 hours in the bungles experience, and now you're doing this milk run postal trip, what was the biggest thing you took away from that experience?
I think 2 things. One would be remote area navigating. So the aeroplane that I used mostly to do the mail run didn't have a GPS in it. It really was a map, a pencil, a compass and a watch, and off you went. And I only got unsure of my position a couple of times. But by the end of my year and a half up there, I was pretty good at visual navigating. And that was really satisfying because I have a real interest in that kind of navigating and I've always enjoyed it. So to get that skill up to that level was really satisfying. And the other one was probably the stick and rudder skills. The worst airplane I flew up there was the Cessna 207 because it was quite underpowered. It's just hot up there, in the Kimberley. In the summer, it's the wet season and it can be up to the mid-40s. And in the winter, it's in the mid-30s. So the airplane performance was always marginal. So you really got a fine touch on the controls with that airplane because you were always on the edge of the performance envelope.
Yeah, definitely hot, high, and overweight.
Yeah, I mean, we tried hard not to overload the airplanes, but sometimes you had freight that you didn't know how much it weighed. Sometimes you had passengers that you didn't know how much they weighed.
Yeah.
So it was definitely a learning curve, having gone from flying Piper Warriors as an instructor with a student and half tanks to fully loaded Cessnas on a really hot day out of a short dirt strip. I remember one day not getting above 1,500 feet all the way from one of the stations back to Kununurra, and I'd find little cumulus clouds and do a little bit of thermal surfing to gain another couple of hundred feet.
Fabulous.
Yeah, so that was good. It really honed your stick and rudder skills from that point of view.
Yeah, so basically you were pilot in command. You had the responsibility of delivering mail to lots of remote areas, away from the boss, obviously a good thing sometimes. In the absence of GPS, your navigation skills were really honed. And as you said before, you had a thing for maps and stuff like that, navigation. So that was great. And obviously the good old stick and rudder skills. So these are all honed. So after that year and a half, what happened next?
Well, my goal was always to fly for Qantas. So as soon as I had the minimum experience required to apply for Qantas, I sent off an application. And what I didn't know was that at this point in time, Qantas had been going through quite a large expansion and had been recruiting heavily for about a year and a half already. So they'd hoovered up all of the regional airline pilots. They'd hoovered up all of the high-end, high-time GA pilots. And they were really down to the bottom of the barrel of low-time GA pilots. So I received a positive response from my application. So I was invited back to Sydney to do the initial assessment, which is a barrage of psychometric testing and hand-eye coordination testing and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I passed that, so I was invited back again for a simulator ride, and that was great fun. You got thrown in a 747 simulator, and you got 45 minutes of just climbs, descents, heading changes, instrument approaches, just to see how you go.
Yeah,
and that was a real buzz for someone that had only flown predominantly single-engine VFR aeroplanes. To be thrown in this big glass cockpit jet was just incredible.
Amazing, huh?
Yeah, I remember walking out of that and going, even if I don't get the job, it was worth it just to come and do this sim ride, because that was really cool.
That is cool. And that was what I was going to ask you, actually, because obviously, you said you always wanted to work for Qantas, and as a pilot, as a commercial pilot anyway, this is obviously a natural progression. Did you feel like you had the pressure of, if I don't do this, then it's all over, or did you have other avenues?
Yeah, I didn't think it was all over. I guess I put myself under pressure because I really wanted the job. But at the same time, I'd got the positive nods from Qantas for their interview process. I'd also been offered a job in Darwin, probably the largest city in northern tropical Australia, to fly for a company that had a couple of single-engine airplanes, but a lot of multi-engine airplanes. So all the way up to, I think they had Metros at that time. So there was multi-crew, multi-engine turbine progression available with that company. So even if I didn't get the job with Qantas, I knew that my career was still going to be able to progress. And I was only young. I was 22. So I knew I had plenty of time up my sleeve at that stage as well.
Yeah, exactly. I have to remember that you started at 15. So everything you've done so far is what some people do in their whole career. So and we haven't even touched on anything yet. So
yeah, so I obviously did well enough in the sim ride. I got called back for an interview. The interview was a thoroughly unpleasant experience, being grilled by a couple of senior Qantas pilots for an hour. But again, I must have done all right, because I remember I was in a tiny little Aboriginal community called Turkey Creek. I'd flown one of the doctors down there for the day. And as a pilot, you'd fly the doctor down in the morning, and then you'd just sit around town all day doing nothing until the doctor finished, and you'd fly them home in the afternoon. And my girlfriend in Kununurra got a hold of me and said, "You have to ring Qantas. They just rang looking for you. You've got to ring them." So I rang them back and got offered a job over the phone.
Fantastic.
And it just blew me away. I was just over the moon, and I had to keep myself together enough to fly the doctor back to Kununurra and not do something stupid.
Yeah, I've got a big smile on my face now, so I can imagine what your face must have been like.
Yeah, absolutely. I just remember that night. We had a huge party. I had way too much beer. I rang everyone that I ever knew in the entire universe and told them that I'd got this job. Yeah, it was just incredible. And the start date wasn't for a few months, so I think I had 6 more weeks of flying up there, which was the most enjoyable 6 weeks, because I knew it was coming to an end and I was going to something bigger and better. But in the back of my mind, it was just this little voice saying, "Just don't crash. Just don't crash. Just got to survive this 6 weeks."
Yeah, and just so you got 6 weeks back in the field, as it were. But what about your colleagues? Were they sort of in the similar processes as you, applying for jobs? So everyone, were they supportive?
They were very supportive. Apparently, I was the first person to get a job straight with Qantas from this little company. So everyone was pretty amazed, including myself. But it was a real indication of how much movement was going on in the industry at that time. So I was going to Qantas, but a lot of my mates were going to bigger general aviation companies. Others were going to regional airlines. So within the space of the next 18 months from when I joined Qantas, pretty much every single pilot that I'd worked with up there had progressed to bigger and better things. So it was a really interesting time to be in the industry.
Wow. And I think what I've picked up along the way as well is all about peaks and troughs with aviation industry. So you've got to, depending on what part of the wave you're on, you've got to ride it all the way, right?
Yeah, that's right. And, at the time I just thought I was amazing, but in hindsight, it wasn't that. There'd been this, huge expansion in the industry and all of this movement. And I was just riding the tail end of that wave. It really was right place, right time. And in hindsight, I was just so lucky that everything lined up at the time.
Fabulous. Okay. So what happened next then? So 6 weeks is up, you pack your bags. Where did you go next?
Yeah, I drove the 4,500 kilometres back to Sydney by myself, and my car didn't quite make it. The rear right-hand wheel bearing failed with about 15 kilometres to go. So I arrived at my aunt's place in Sydney on the back of a flatbed truck, which was pretty funny. But I made it. I got back to Sydney, found a little flat to live in, and I started ground school with 8 other pilots as second officers on the Boeing 747-400. So we did 6 weeks of ground school and another few weeks of full flight simulators, and then started our line training, sitting in the back seat of the 747 as a second officer flying around the world. As I said, for someone that had only flown VFR single-engine airplanes, it was incredible. It was just mind-blowing.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sort of speechless there. Wow. Okay. So you've gone from, was it a case that they just had an opening for the 747? Could this have easily have been a 737 or any other aircraft? You just got lucky with this?
Not any other aircraft. At that stage, Qantas operated the 747-400, the 747-300, and the 767-300. And those 3 airplanes, they all had second officers. So not all airlines use second officers. A lot of long-haul airlines will use cruise first officers or something similar. So as the second officer, you're third in charge. You're only in a flying seat, nowhere near the ground. So when I joined, we were allowed to hop in one of the control seats above 3,000 feet. So you didn't do any takeoffs or landings. You were there really as in-flight relief for the operating crew and as a second set of eyes to support the operation. So I could have been put on the 767 or either of the 747s. Qantas doesn't accept any direct entry first officers, or it certainly didn't when I joined.
Wow.
So it was just a lottery, and I got lucky and got stuck on the 400.
I love that. Got stuck on the 400. So how old were you at this moment?
I was 22.
22, second officer, Boeing 747, Qantas. That sounds pretty good.
And my most vivid memory from my first flight was departing London at night, and we took off to the west. And at 3,000 feet, the captain hopped out and I hopped in the captain's seat and disconnected the autopilot and started hand flying. And we got cleared for a right-hand turn to head east towards Europe, and we levelled off at 6,000 feet and had our speed restriction cancelled. It was a beautiful, clear night over London. I had all the lights of London out underneath me, and I'm there hand flying a 747 at 350 knots at 6,000 feet over London.
Fabulous.
It was just amazing. Still renders me speechless just thinking about it.
Yeah, wow, fabulous. So I sort of live just to the west of Heathrow Airport, and so hey, maybe I saw you. But we see the aircraft sort of doing whatever they're doing, whether they're in holds, and it's a very busy area. And being a general aviation pilot, we're sort of stuck below the TMA. Yeah, it's very busy, and obviously even above us when we look up, it's busy up there as well. So wow, 22 years old, hand flying a Boeing 747 at 6,000 feet over London, heading across the channel. I can't think of anything better than that. That's awesome. So what was next then? So how many hours did you do in the as a second officer, and what happened next?
So I spent 3 years as a second officer, and I received a promotion to first officer on the Boeing 747-300, and that was quite an anomaly. Promotions are all based on your seniority, and normally the seniority required to get onto the 747-300 was quite high. But at that stage, Qantas had been retiring them, and they only had a couple left. So no one was bidding onto the fleet, and I had to bid in for everything. I wanted any promotion that would come.
Yeah.
So I got this promotion, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of numbers out of seniority. So I did the ground school, and I just started the simulators for that when there was a change to the flying program, and I was deemed to be surplus to requirement, so the training was cancelled. And because I was nowhere near senior enough for any other first officer spot, I got sent back to the 747-400 as a second officer. So that was a bit disappointing at the time, but all that happened was that I spent another 12 months as a second officer, and then a promotion to first officer on the 767 appeared.
Yeah.
So I went through the training process for that and started flying the 767 as a first officer, which again was a fantastic experience. I think at that point I'd done about 2,900 odd hours on the 747.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's a predominantly long haul operation, I think that about 1,000 hours of that I was asleep in the bunk. So
it's still loggable, right?
That's apparently, yeah.
We don't need to tell anyone that though, right? No one will know.
No one will know.
Yeah. So from a second officer, so what was life like? So second officer, you're the relief pilot for obviously the more experienced crews, and then you transition onto the 767. What was it like just moving from the bigger aircraft to the smaller, and obviously your involvement in the each flight changed. So what was that like?
It was definitely a step up, especially because on the 767, by the time I got onto it, most of the long haul flying had disappeared. So it was really Southeast Asia and the Pacific and the domestic trunk routes. So very few flights had a second officer. So it really was just you and the captain. So it was a change for me going to a 2-crew operation. And yeah, whereas on the 747, if an engineer on the ground came up to ask a question before departure, the captain or the first officer would answer that. And I just remember on my first flight after I checked a line on the 767, the captain was outside doing the walk around and an engineer came up and asked me a question. And I just thought, I'm supposed to know the answer to that now. I'm the first officer. And it was a bit of a shock.
Do you remember the question?
No, I have absolutely no idea what the question was. It was probably something simple, but it was just, I guess it came home to me at that point that, okay, I'm now second in charge of this. And when the captain's not here, I'm in charge. So I need to know my stuff now.
Yeah.
But flying was good because the mix of international and domestic flying meant that you got lots of sectors, lots of takeoffs and landings. So you gained a lot of experience quite quickly. After sort of the initial 12 months, I felt pretty settled in and I really enjoyed the flying. That mix of domestic flying, lots of hand flying, and then some longer international flights was a really great mix. Not a lot of jet lag, lots of hand flying. It was just great fun. And the 767, especially on the shorter sectors, it's an airplane that's designed to fly for 10 or 12 hours.
Yeah.
Flying from Sydney to Melbourne, it's a 1-hour flight, even with a full load of passengers, with the fuel for that flight, and even the engine's fully derated, a minimum power takeoff. The performance after takeoff was outstanding. Yeah. So it was a lot of fun to fly.
Sounds great. And could you actually correlate any sort of benefits of the bush flying or any of your stick and rudder stuff? Did that help at all on the airliners, or was that just a thing of the past now?
No, absolutely. Landing an airplane, regardless of what size, if you're flying the airplane, it's your stick and rudder skills that count. And you would encounter situations flying in the airlines that you would flying in the bush as well, changeable weather conditions, landing in strong gusty crosswinds, wind shear close to the ground, all that sort of stuff. And you're pushing and pulling in a big jet just as you are in a little airplane. So, and that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed the 767 is you got to do a lot of that.
Yeah, 767. It's great to hear those old skills being transitioned and still being used for airline pilots. All you have to do is look at some of the sort of videos of aircraft landing in strong crosswinds just to see, when you actually watched what's going on, the rudder inputs is definitely just the same as landing a 182 on a breezy day as well. So sounds great.
Yeah, it was. And you definitely earn your money some days, that's for sure.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, so you've got about 1,000 hours. You had 12 months on the 767 and you're feeling settled in. What happened next?
I guess in the background of this was during my, the tail end of my 747 flying as well, is that I've always loved flying little airplanes. So even when I was an airline pilot, I would take friends for scenic flights in little airplanes, go and muck around because it was fun. And on the 767, I reactivated my instructor rating and I started doing some instructing part-time outside of my airline flying. And this was around the time of the global financial crisis. Qantas suddenly, found it had quite a large downturn in its flying. That meant that they had too many pilots. So pilots were allowed to go and take leave without pay and seek other opportunities elsewhere, and also to take reduced rosters. So I put my hand up to fly 2/3 of a normal roster, and that freed up flying hours to go and do other stuff. So I went and worked as a flying instructor part-time. I went and flew a Cessna Caravan for a skydiving company, just a day here and there as they needed. And that got me thinking about what else could I do with my flying beyond airline flying. And one of my friends, I don't know why he had a copy, but he had a copy of the European Space Agency annual report.
Okay, it's pretty random, isn't it? Yeah.
Totally random. I have no idea why he had it, but he's an engineer, so maybe was some interest in that. And I had to read through that and just thought, wow, this is fascinating. And I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2007 or 2009, but EASA opened up applications for astronauts. And my father was born in Britain, so I have a British passport. So I was eligible to apply. And I thought, well, why not?
Yeah, why not? Let's be a spaceman.
To be an astronaut. Yeah. And of course, I didn't get through the first round of applications because I was woefully underqualified to be an astronaut. But it just got me thinking, and I had a look at the people that were successful and what their qualifications were. And the ones that got in from a flying background all had aerospace engineering degrees and test pilot experience. And I thought, well, maybe I should look into that. That sounds interesting. So at Qantas, they do test flying as part of their maintenance program. So when the airplanes go in for a major check where they're disassembled and reassembled, they go through a test flying program before they're released back to the line for passenger flying.
Yeah. So
I got talking to a couple of the pilots that were involved in that and expressed some interest, and was lucky enough to be trained up as a maintenance test pilot on the 767. And that was really interesting. It added another area of interest to the airline flying. Once every few months, one of these maintenance test flights would come up. And it's essentially a 2 to 4 hour checklist. It's very procedural. You're just going through all of the systems, all of the redundancy systems, and just making sure that everything's working normally. So you do that whole procedure on the ground, and then the next day you go and do the whole thing in the air. And it was great fun because it was technical flying, and you got to do cool stuff like shut down engines and restart them, and check that the ram air turbine would deploy when certain hydraulic systems were switched off and things like that.
Wow, that sounds amazing. It's literally sounds like it also compounds your actual knowledge anyway, and it would definitely make you a better pilot, and you could do all those things that you don't really want to do or you probably only ever done in the simulator. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So I really enjoyed that, and that spurred on a bit of interest in that area. So I enrolled in an engineering degree, just part-time, again, because I had the time outside of flying because I was doing this reduced roster. So I was doing one subject a semester of this engineering degree, flying with Qantas, doing a little bit of instructing and skydiving, flying on the side. And life was really interesting. I was really enjoying that. And thinking about the test flying stuff, I felt that I really didn't know much about it. And I thought this would be interesting to get involved in with the light aircraft side. The Sports Aircraft Association here, who is involved in all the experimental home-built side of general aviation, they have designated people who can go and test fly aircraft. And I thought, well, that'd be really interesting to get involved in the future. But I didn't feel that I knew enough about test flying. So I enrolled myself in a short course. It was called the Introduction to Fixed-Wing Test Flying course at the National Test Pilot School, which is in Mojave in the Californian desert. So I headed over there, and I decided I'd convert my ATPL to an FAA ATP while I was there, because you can do a 2 or 3 day short course to do that. And it was while I was in Los Angeles doing this that I started feeling really thirsty. I noticed that my vision had got a bit blurry, and I was just feeling weird. So I took myself off to the local medical centre and just explained my symptoms to the doctor. And he took one look at me and checked my blood sugar level. And my blood sugar level was about 5 times higher than it should have been.
Wow.
And he asked me if I'd had anything to eat recently. And I said, no, I hadn't eaten since breakfast. So he said, look, you've probably got diabetes. And he gave me a shot of insulin, told me that I probably shouldn't fly anymore. And that because I didn't have any health insurance there, that I should probably get on the next flight back home to Australia. So I knew then and there that my commercial flying career had stopped.
Wow.
And I remember ringing my fiancée at the time. This was 6 weeks before our wedding.
Yeah.
I rang her up from the other side of the world and told her what had happened. And it was just totally unexpected. And I just remember sitting in the doctor's surgery in the corner of one of the rooms, just quietly crying to myself.
How did you realise that your life, your career had just stopped there and then? And how did you feel about that?
I think I knew enough about diabetes, because there's 2 types of diabetes: type 2 diabetes, which doesn't immediately cancel your commercial license, and type 1 that does. And I think at that point I must have known enough about diabetes to know that it was most likely that I had type 1 diabetes and that my flying career had stopped then and there. And I'm lucky that I have quite a dark sense of humour. So I think that kicked in as a bit of a preservation.
Yeah, self-preservation, totally, yeah.
I just thought this could not get any funnier. Here I am just about to go and do this super cool test flying course, and I've got to a point in my career where I'm starting to shape it into the direction that I want, and it's really interesting. I'm doing all this different flying, and I'm loving it, and it's all just stopped.
Yeah, I totally. It's like you were literally climbing to the top of the food chain, the flying food chain. You're about to go to the Californian desert, joining test pilot school, aviator glasses on. Everything was just riding and blowing up for you, and then it all left.
Yeah, evaporated. Yeah. Here I am sitting on the opposite side of the planet where I don't know anyone and wondering what to do. So I did the only thing that I knew what to do. So I got in my hire car, and I checked the Qantas schedule to see when the next flight home was, and the next one I could make wasn't until the following evening. So I had about 36 hours to kill. Yeah. And I was at Riverside Airport in the eastern side of LA, and I'd always wanted to go to the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino. So I hopped in my car and I drove to the Planes of Fame Museum, and I spent the afternoon looking at all these incredible planes, iconic planes that have been involved in some of the landmark discoveries of test flying and aviation development from a military point of view, from a civilian point of view, and just wandering around looking at them going, I love these airplanes. These are fascinating, but I'm not going to fly anything like it. It's a real shame.
That's a real tease, isn't it? And obviously it must have been a crazy time for you emotionally. But wow.
Yeah, it was just so stressful. I mean, I got back home to Australia and I got all the appropriate healthcare. My diabetes got formally diagnosed and managed and was brought under control quite quickly. I had never really been sick, so I had over 6 months of sick leave saved up. So I just went on sick leave and I got married, which was fantastic. And I just received all this, this huge amount of support from my family, from my friends, and from my colleagues. So it was a really, I guess it was a dichotomous time because I was horrendously upset about losing my career. But on the other hand, all this wonderful support that I received from all these different aspects of my life was incredible. I guess that really helped get me through the worst of it.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's like, you were going through a personal dilemma, and it's interesting when the chips are down and you get your back's against the wall, and it's interesting to see what support rises to the top from your family and friends, and it looks like you really benefited from that. And it's always good to know, and it's great to see who has your back.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've 6 months sick leave saved up. What happened next?
So I formally left Qantas at the end of my sick leave, and I was halfway through that engineering degree. So I just kept that going, just more to give me something to do than anything else. So I finished my engineering degree, and I used that time to have a serious think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And at the same time, my wife somehow became pregnant, and my son was born the day my master's thesis was due, actually, for that engineering degree. So that was a pretty incredible time.
Yeah.
And that in itself opens up a whole new part of your life, suddenly becoming a new parents and rising to the challenges of that.
Yeah.
And during that time, all that thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, I guess I recognized that I'd always had an interest in medicine. I always remember when I was an undergraduate at uni, my friends that I lived on campus with were studying medicine. I always leafed through their textbooks because they were interesting. I've always been interested in how the human body has worked because it's such a complex machine. The human side, like the personal interaction side of a medical career, really attracted me. So I thought, I'll have a crack at it. So I went and sat the entrance exam for medicine and got through that, got offered an interview, went through the interview process and got through that and got offered a spot starting at the beginning of 2012. So I was lucky enough that they offer medicine as a postgraduate degree a lot of the time here in Australia. So it's a 4-year program. And again, it's kind of serendipitous that I had started that engineering degree because to get into graduate medicine, you need to have completed a tertiary qualification sometime in the last 10 years. Yeah. If I hadn't done that engineering degree, it would have been too long ago since I'd done my undergraduate degree, and I would have had to have gone and done something else first. And I think that would have been enough of a barrier to not send me down the medical path.
It's funny how things turn out the way they're supposed to be, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, that's right. So I started medical school, which started off not too bad. It was kind of like how I remembered university. It's a little bit different having a young child in the house while you're trying to study, but it seemed manageable. But the degree just got harder and harder. Medicine is just a bottomless pit of knowledge. You could do a PhD on pretty much every dot point in every lecture we were given.
Yeah.
Learning medicine is as much learning where to draw the line about how much you want to know about each topic or how much you can retain on each topic. And the final 2 years of the degree are very practical. So you actually spend 4 of your 5 weekdays in the hospital attached to a team and 1 day a week doing lectures. And then on top of that, there's the syllabus that you're trying to keep on top of. So the degree progressed from first year, pretty standard university timetable, through to the end of 4th year, where medicine was essentially a full-time job, and I was studying every evening. And in the lead up to final exams, I was studying every day and every evening on weekends as well.
Yeah.
And by that stage, we'd had our second child. Our daughter was born at the start of 3rd year. So life with 2 young children and my wife working and me doing this medical degree, life was really hard.
I'm speechless. Yeah, you definitely weren't messing around with the game of life here. And, marriage, a wedding, 2 children, a second degree, a new discipline, and obviously, and it being medicine. That's crazy.
I couldn't do it again. I know I couldn't do it again. And I know it almost broke me, because I got through my entire airline pilot career without ever needing to drink coffee.
Yeah.
4th year medical school with 2 young children, I started drinking coffee, and I still drink coffee now.
Yeah. It also, when the coffee comes out, that means it's serious.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I received a tremendous amount of support from my wife, my wife's family, my family, helping out with looking after the kids and pick-ups and drop-offs, and just allowing me the time that I needed to study to get through it. And I survived. I definitely couldn't say I was a brilliant academic student at medical school, but I have passed. So, I graduated almost a year and a half ago now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I started working as a junior doctor.
Fabulous. Okay, so just having a look at, you said during your medical training or medical study, you started drinking coffee. So obviously, is this next level studying and knowledge accumulation as compared to the airline pilot? I'm just trying to think of any sort of about the study and the processes, and I'm thinking about checklists here.
Well, I guess, the 2 other big areas of study I've done have been my air transport pilot license theory and the theory required for the 2 Boeing endorsements, and my engineering degree. And to compare medicine to those, I would say that the breadth of knowledge is similar to what you need for your ATPLs. That's one of the reasons I love the airline flying, is you need to know a little bit about a whole bunch of different stuff, human factors, meteorology, engineering, aerodynamics, navigation, and medicine's similar. It's just so broad, and you need to know at least a little bit about a lot of different things to begin with. Comparing it to the engineering, I would say that medicine, some aspects of medicine are as theoretically complicated, some of the stuff I did in the engineering degree, but probably not as conceptually difficult. Like, I really remember doing the fluid dynamics study as part of my engineering degree, and the equations in that really bending my brain. But once you sort of got a handle on the concepts and knew how to apply the equation, then that was, you could go from there. I haven't found anything in medicine that I've struggled with conceptually as much as that. But the sheer volume of knowledge is so much greater in medicine than in engineering. So they were kind of very different degrees to study.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of my medical knowledge has basically pushed all that engineering knowledge out of my brain, because I don't have enough brain space to keep both of them in there.
Yeah, it's definitely a bucket, isn't it, in terms of knowledge? So once the bucket's full, something has to leave before you can add some more to it. So, and just going back now, so obviously you had that crazy news back in California, and you returned back to Australia. I take it all flying ceased at that point?
Yes, it did. And it's been a gradual process to get to the point where I am now, where I have a Class 2 medical private medical with no restrictions, and I have my multi-engine instrument rating back. So the progression was, I got my recreational license back. So I think in the UK that would be equivalent to my NPPL.
That's right, yeah.
So I was allowed to fly day VFR aircraft with a maximum takeoff weight of 600 kilos or less, and with 1 passenger. So that was great. I could at least do some flying. And because I've always loved flying little airplanes, it was great to be able to still do something that I loved. And the progression from there was that I got my Class 2 medical back to allow some private flying, but with a restriction that I must fly with a co-pilot. And the body that looks after the recreational aircraft in Australia interpreted that to allow me to instruct as long as the person that I was instructing had gone solo. So I was very lucky that they had a practical interpretation of that limitation. As long as someone was there to be able to land the airplane in the event that I became incapacitated, they were happy with that. So that was great. So suddenly I could do some instructing. And that's how I got involved with the club that I'm currently involved with. And they fly the Aeropract Foxbat, which is a fantastic little airplane. And I've instructed on a casual basis with them ever since.
In terms of the restrictions and what did you have to overcome regarding your type 1 diabetes? Was there any red tape that you had to sort of negotiate? Obviously, their interpretation there was a positive one, but was it a bit hard work? Did you have to push a bit?
Yeah, the interpretation by the recreational aircraft body, that was easy. They just accepted what the ruling was on my Class 2 medical.
Yeah.
Dealing with the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, that was where the red tape was involved. But again, I'm very lucky that I live in Australia, because Australia is, I think, one of only 4 countries in the world that allows type 1 diabetics to fly privately without restriction.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of showing them that you're well controlled, basically. The biggest risk of type 1 diabetes is hypoglycemia, whose effects are similar to being drunk. It just impairs your decision making, and after too long, you become unconscious. So both of those things are not something you want to happen while you're flying an airplane.
Not at all.
So with good diabetes control, you can avoid that. So the Civil Aviation Safety Authority here just requires a fairly solid chunk of data to show that you are well controlled. So, I have to go and see my diabetes doctor every 3 months. I have to have regular blood tests. I have to monitor my blood sugar level regularly day to day as well as in flight, and I have to submit all of that to them every year for their perusal. So they gave me my medical firstly with that restriction, and then after a period of time demonstrating my stability, they then removed that restriction. And so now I'm just like any other private pilot, except I have a lot of paperwork I have to fill in every year to renew my medical.
Wow. I know a few type 1 diabetics, and I know the blood sugar management is a key aspect there. Some people don't always have the discipline to do it, and obviously can have some serious repercussions later on. So I think this is a great thing, one, to keep you in the air, but obviously on a personal level for you to remain healthy, and obviously you've got a commitment, family and children now, so it's to keep you on the straight and narrow from a diabetic point of view as well.
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny, it's a kind of a two-way street for me, because I know that if I keep good control, I can keep flying. So that's the carrot. But yeah, in the other direction is that the better control that I have, the better my long-term health will be. But also, my flying background means that I have exactly the right sort of brain and personality to manage my diabetes well, because I kind of approach it like I'm going flying. I have these variables that I'm balancing. I have fuel in my tanks, which is food. It gets used at various rates depending on what my activity levels and my stress levels are. And I have insulin, and I can vary the amount of insulin I need, and it lasts for different amounts of time. And I'm sort of always running mental calculations on what's going on with my diabetes, just the same way as when I was an airline pilot, always running mental calculations on the fuel state and diversion options and your energy management on descent. It's funny how it's worked out like that.
I could see you doing a seminar on that to diabetics. That sounds like a great idea with those analogies. There you go. You can have that one, all right?
All right. And
in terms of, are you alone being a diabetic pilot? Are you alone? Is there anyone else you can sort of swap stories with and relate to?
Absolutely. I'm definitely not alone. There is a fantastic group of people. In Australia, it's a fairly small group. There's probably about a dozen pilots that I'm in touch with who have type 1 diabetes and who fly. And they're from a variety of backgrounds. Some are just private pilots. Some, like me, are ex-airline pilots. Others are just recreational ultralight pilots. But around the world, and particularly in the UK, there's a fantastic body called Flying with Diabetes, who started up by a fantastic gentleman by the name of 𝗚𝗏𝗏, who was an RAF fighter pilot when he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And he's really been at the spearhead of proving that type 1 diabetes isn't a limitation when it comes to flying. He circumnavigated the world in a Beechcraft Baron. He's set all sorts of point-to-point records, and he's still very active at the moment. There's another chap that's involved with him who, between them, they own a couple of Vans aircraft, and they've now started setting formation speed endorsements point-to-point. And they run seminars they're definitely very involved in the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, so they attend their open days, they perform flypasts for them, and they're very enthusiastic about promoting type 1 diabetes itself, but also pushing the boundaries with flying with type 1 diabetes. So those guys are a real inspiration for me. And I would love to emulate some of the things that they've done in the UK here in Australia.
Fantastic. I'm just looking now. I can see flyingwithdiabetes.com. their website, and wow, they've got a full 2017 calendar that looks like they've been going for a while, and it looks like some amazing stuff. So I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes page as well.
Yeah, please do. They're a fantastic group of guys, and they are so supportive. They've got a little Facebook group that you can join if there are any other type 1 diabetic pilots listening out there. It's great to just be able to see what other type 1 pilots are doing around the world.
Fabulous. Okay, so what happens next? So obviously you're a junior doctor now, and how's your current flying now?
I always feel like I'm never doing enough flying, but I'm instructing for the club once a fortnight, so that's great because it keeps that little corner of my brain alive and keeps my stick and rudder skills up. I try to get up and do some instrument flying, inside the recency limits for my instrument rating. Yeah. So I'll go up and try and do a GPS approach and an ILS approach and a couple of night circuits and stuff like that. And if possible, I'll try and incorporate that into actually going somewhere and doing something, taking some friends for a scenic flight or flying to another town to go to a fly-in or an air show or something like that. So I average, probably 5 to 10 hours a month at the moment at best. But what I really need to do is to try and incorporate some flying into my professional life, because at the moment they're competing interests. I have to go to work, and I have a family, and I have to go flying, and they're three separate things that require time.
Absolutely, yeah, I get that on a personal level as well. So yeah, let me know how you fix that.
Yeah, I'm working on a few things, but it's going to be interesting. Okay,
I mentioned in the bio, and you're a junior doctor now, but you're aiming for a career in general practice and aerospace medicine. Explain a bit about the aerospace medicine, and how, maybe this is going to be your solution.
I think it will be. So the aerospace medicine, at its bread and butter end, is pilot medicals. So you and I both go for our regular pilot medicals, and we go and see an aviation doctor for that. And then at the pointy end, research into the effects on the human body of spaceflight and everything there is in between. And there's various different aspects. There's people that focus more on military flying. There's people that focus more on civilian flying. Others that are more interested in passenger fitness to fly. So there's different areas inside aviation medicine that you can specialise in. For me, I don't know if aviation or aerospace medicine will become 100% of my career. I'm very interested in becoming a general practitioner. I'm really attracted to the variety of medicine that exposes you to. In country Australia, they often struggle to get general practitioners, and they also struggle to get aviation doctors in country Australia. So getting back to that sort of combining all of my interests in the future, I can see at some point when I've finished my GP training, which won't be for another 3 or 4 years, where hopefully I'll be able to fly myself out to a country town that needs a GP a day a week or needs an aviation doctor occasionally. And that will tick all the boxes.
Yeah, that phrase, the flying doctor, that was coined from Australia, right?
It does. That's that's a very different style of medicine, and doesn't involve actually being the pilot, unfortunately. People always ask me that. They said, "Oh, you'll be a flying doctor." And I always say, "No, I'd be a terrible flying doctor, because I'd be sitting in the back of the airplane trying to look after the patient, but being horribly distracted by what the pilot's doing." I think separating the flying and the medicine so that I'm just flying, and then when I am where I want to go, then I'm just doing medicine. I think that's probably safer for everyone.
Good to see you. Get in. If you can drag yourself into the back of here, I'll take you somewhere, but I'm flying this thing.
That's right. But you're on your own, because I'm having too much fun flying.
Here's some paracetamol.
Yeah, that wouldn't go down well.
Excellent. Okay. So is that where you are at the moment?
That's where I'm at the moment. So I've been doing my junior doctor years part-time, because just to basically get a bit of work-life balance back after those final years of med school. So next year I will commence full-time work and hopefully start my GP training, and that will be 3 years of training. And at the end of that, I'll be a qualified GP and a qualified aviation doctor, and I can start tailoring my career into that direction that I want it to go.
Wow, that's fabulous, and good luck to that. I really I wish you all the best, and and let us know how you get on with that. Really interested.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, let's just touch on aircraft types now. You've explained a fabulous career. You had the short aviation career, and it's not, you're in part 2 now, moving into your second career, which is a blessing in itself. But how many different aircraft types have you flown, and what aircraft do you hold the closest to your heart, and why?
Well, my logbook says that I've flown 47 different types of aircraft. But the big caveat to that is only 7 of those I have more than 100 hours in. And I've heard many people say that you've never really flown an aeroplane until you've got at least 100 hours in it. And I'd kind of tend to agree with that. I love different airplanes. I'm always fascinated by the differences that different airplanes present. So I'm always up for flying something different. So yeah, my little spreadsheet here tells me that I've got less than 10 hours in 27 different aircraft types. So that's a lot of stuffing around with airplanes.
Yeah.
But of those airplanes, the ones that I hold dear to my heart would definitely be the 767, because it was the first heavy jet that I really flew. I loved the performance that it had, so I did really enjoy flying it. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, I have to mention the classic 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗶𝗀. I've only got a few hours in a 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗶, but it was just an absolute joy to fly. And if ever the opportunity comes up again to fly one, I'll jump at it, because it was just such a pleasure. So those two airplanes are definitely favourites. But because I just love so many different airplanes, I have to mention the Cessna 206 that I flew up in the bush doing the mail run. It was just to be able to chuck half a ton of junk in the airplane and roar off out of a short dirt strip. It was just such a great workhorse. And the airplane that I instruct on now, the Foxbat, it's like a modern 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗶. It's a delight to fly. It's so easy and stable to fly. And I love taking people flying in that airplane that have never flown before, because I can teach them to fly in under an hour, and I can generally talk them through their first or second landing. And it's always, everyone just loves that little airplane.
Yeah. So in terms
and
of
I could go on.
Yeah, I could imagine. So
I'll stop there.
Yeah. In terms of the 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗶, that is actually on my hit list for this year. And so from someone who's, how many hours did you do in that? Just less than 10? Is that one of those ones, less than 10?
Oh yeah, it is. I think, let's see, the spreadsheet says 3.2 hours.
Okay.
So it's not very much.
Well, you're 3.2 hours more experience than myself. So what advice would you give me just for going from a typical tricycle gear aircraft into the Cub?
Oh, find a good tailwheel instructor. And
Excellent. Okay.
But once you're in the air, open the windows, stick your elbows out in the breeze, and go on a scenic flight. Puttering around at slow speed, at 1,000 feet, and enjoying the view with the breeze in your face, it's just magical. And that's what I love about it. And I think also it sort of ties in with me growing up in the garage with old cars that smelt of wood and leather and oil.
Yeah.
And the 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗶 smelt like that as well. So a bit of nostalgia in there for me, definitely.
Fabulous. And then the Foxbat is your new version of the Cub.
It's the modern equivalent, I reckon. It's just so much fun.
Fabulous. Okay. Obviously, I mentioned there you've got literally on two careers. It looks like you've got your second aviation type career is moving forward and will develop into the future. But so far, what has been your proudest moment in your flying career?
Probably being checked to line as a first officer on the 767. I worked really hard for that, and I really felt a sense of achievement when I finished that training and got handed my epaulets with the 3 stripes on it. That was really, really satisfying.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, you did more. The sectors were more interesting. You had more takeoff and landings, and eventually you were able to answer engineer questions, right?
Yes, the simple ones.
Excellent. That's good. Okay, Jeremy, this is my favorite part of the show. Welcome to the quick fire checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready?
Sounds fantastic.
Okay, let's go. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
If in doubt, don't.
How have you applied that?
Probably every time I go flying. Flying is a constant stream of sort of small decisions and risk-benefit analyses and, plans and backup plans, and you're thinking of doing something and there's that little niggle. I don't know. I won't do it. I'll take the conservative path. And I think as a private pilot, that's definitely important. But as a commercial pilot, it was just essential. You need to be so conservative when you're flying.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. It's like with the commercial flying, there are obviously sort of standard operating procedures sort of to guide you and I guess help with that decision. But as a private pilot, you're on your own and it's up to you to be able to make that risk analysis yourself. So definitely a great piece of advice there. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Oh, for me, it'd definitely be Google Earth. As soon as Google Earth was invented, I started using it for every flight I ever planned. Not for the airline flying, but for any of the private flying I did, especially for cross-country flying. I've just found it such an invaluable tool to give you an idea of what the terrain you're flying over is like. In Australia, there's vast swathes of country that you just would not fly over in a single-engine aeroplane, because if you had a forced landing, you're stuffed. And there's one of those areas immediately to the west of Sydney. So the aviation charts are fantastic. They give you an idea of the topography. But I just found Google Earth such an excellent adjunct to those to really let you know if you're flying over suitable terrain or not for forced landings.
Great piece of advice there, and definitely a great resource. Okay, can you share one of your personal habits that you find useful, Jeremy, and believe contributes to your flying success?
Well, definitely planning and adaptability. You've got to have a plan. And me, generally, I have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And plan the flight, fly the plan, but you need to be flexible and adaptable enough to recognise that if your plan is not going to plan, that you need to change your plan or revert to your backup plan. So I think that's something I've always tried to apply.
Yeah, safety first and be flexible, it sounds like there as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, trikes or tail draggers, Jeremy?
Tail draggers.
Yeah, you got bitten by the bug, didn't you?
Which is kind of ironic, because I think I've only got about 40 hours in tail draggers, but I just love the challenge that they pose. They're just so satisfying to fly.
I'm smiling now because I can't wait to get on this as well, personally. Cool.
Yeah, do it. Absolutely.
Okay, can you recommend one aviation-related book?
Probably my favourite flying book of all time is a book called 𝗘𝗽𝗴𝗃𝗃 by 𝗣𝗶𝗹𝗃𝗃. It's an old book now, but it's an autobiography of a chap who started flying in the war, World War II. He flew flying boats and bombers and transports in the Pacific during the war. He's an American chap, and then he progressed through to airline flying on the west coast of America, and during the early years of the post-war airline industry. And then he moved on to production test flying, and then eventually experimental test flying with the Douglas Company. And he set, at one point he held the records for speed and altitude. He flew the Douglas skyrocket, which is an incredible aeroplane. And it was one of the airplanes that they've got at the Chino Planes of Fame Museum, which I remember so vividly. It's an amazing story of the different types of flying that he's done, but it's also written in a really easy and approachable manner. And I really loved that book.
Wow, sounds like an interesting guy. I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes. That's The Lonely Sky by 𝗵𝗃𝗃.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, what is your favourite non-essential but essential to you technology gadget in your cockpit?
For me, it's a thing called the Dexcom G5, which is a continuous glucose monitor. So it's a little sensor that lives under my skin, and it has a Bluetooth transmitter that clips on the top of it. And I've got a little black receiver, and it just looks like an old Nokia phone, actually, a little Nokia phone. And I just blue tack that to the dashboard of whatever aeroplane I'm flying. And it sends my blood sugar level every 5 minutes to this little graph on that device. So it makes my diabetes just another system in the aeroplane to monitor, and I can manage it as I go. And I've only started using it about 12 months ago, and it has definitely made my life so much easier, especially when I'm flying.
Wow, the Dexcom G5. So technology for diabetes definitely upgraded. This sits under your skin.
Yeah, so it's this tiny little hair-thin sensor that lives under the skin and is attached to a little square bit of plastic that sticks to my skin with a Band-Aid. Yeah. And then on top of that clips this little Bluetooth transmitter.
Fabulous.
Yeah, and when I'm not flying, it just transmits to my phone. So I've got this little graph on my iPhone. So I just monitor my sugars by looking at my phone. It's excellent.
Wow, it's like a fusion between medicine and technology. I like that a lot.
That's right.
Okay, this is my favourite question now, Jeremy. If you had a time machine and can go back in time and meet your younger self just as you're about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
This is probably a bit of a somber thing. I would say to myself, as a young, enthusiastic and easily excitable man, I would say that if you get that rush of blood to the head where you want to do something spontaneously, that should immediately raise a giant red flag in your brain, and that you should stop and have a serious think about what it is that you just wanted to do, and have a think about the consequences. And then take a deep breath and decide again if you really want to do that. And the background to that is the closest I ever came to killing myself in a light aircraft was a snap decision to buzz someone shortly after takeoff. And I came within inches of a tree that I just hadn't noticed because I hadn't thought about it. And I found myself shortly after takeoff, 5 feet off the ground, inches from this tree, with full aileron deflection to avoid the tree. And it's the worst things in the world. You're low altitude, low speed, high angle bank. I still don't know how I didn't either hit something or stall and write myself off. And very sadly, one of my good friends did a similar thing about 18 months later and did end up crashing and killing himself. Yeah. And I just understand that spontaneity has no place in the cockpit of a light aircraft. What you need to do is to plan and to think ahead, and that's how you'll keep yourself safe.
Yeah, totally great piece of advice there, and it basically reflects back to one of your personal habits that you mentioned earlier about planning and the importance of it. So yeah, it all wraps up really nicely there, Jeremy.
Is the next question happier? Can we end on a happier note than that?
Absolutely, we need to take it somewhere else, don't we? Okay, Inspired Pilots, you can find all the links to all the resources and everything else we've been talking about with today's episode by going to inspiredpilot.com and search for Jeremy in the search bar to find the show notes for this episode. Okay, Jeremy, let's pick this up a little bit towards the end now. Listening to your journey has been great. I think just reading your bio there, it's pretty unbelievable. And I guess most pilots sort of value their pilot license, and especially if it's your career, very highly. And the thought of actually losing that is something which I don't want to, personally, I wouldn't want to bear thinking about. So you've literally, I love the way that you've just bounced back from that, the big negative, and you've just spun it round, pivoted, and you've taken on a new chapter in your life and incorporating aviation as well. So I look forward to hearing that you become an AME, and let's take it from there. So great stories. I love all the Australian flying. So can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance and then share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off? Okay, I would have to say, go flying. And if there's something that you've always wanted to do, go and do it. Go and do that formation endorsement, or go and do a session of spins with an instructor, or go and do that scenic flight over some beautiful part of the country that you've always wanted to see. Do those things that you can only do in a little aeroplane, and share the experience. Take someone up flying who's never been flying before. Show them what you love about it, and show them what is so special about aviation. Things that you and I know, but I think that's what we can share. It's just the magic of aviation. So, get out there and get involved. Fabulous. Share the magic of aviation. Love that, Jeremy. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm always happy to talk aeroplanes. I'm notoriously slow at replying to emails, but my email address is jr568@gmx.com, and I'd be delighted to hear from anyone. Fabulous. I'll make sure that's linked to you on your show notes page as well. Okay, thank you for joining us on the show today, Jeremy. You've been very generous. I know it's getting late there in Australia. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again. It's been an absolute pleasure, Marvin. Good night. Thank you for joining me today for episode 27 of the Inspired Pilot podcast. I really enjoyed talking with Jeremy today, and wow, what an inspiring story. We all have to just deal with the curveballs that life sometimes throws at us, but Jeremy's story definitely shows us that it's not about the cards you were dealt with, but it's how you play them. Jeremy had a good hand and had reached the pinnacle of what many pilots who are aspiring to join the airlines are aiming for. Second officer on the 747, first officer on the 767, even aiming his sights higher at becoming a test pilot with a sneaky eye on the possibility of joining the space program. This guy had made it, as it were. How Jeremy coped when his situation dramatically changed due to his diabetes is truly commendable, and it does show you how having the support of a new wife, key family and friends is priceless in a situation like Jeremy's. He pivoted and turned, setting off on a new pathway, and after a lot of hard work, he eventually qualifies to join the medicine profession. Airline pilot, engineering, medical doctor. That's not a too shabby CV or resume if you ask me. And with regards to his diabetes, I like how Jeremy is using the same meticulous attention to detail and planning from his attitude to flying as he is in managing his own diabetes. This due care and attention at the same time keeps him in the air with his own private flying, which is a win-win. all very inspiring to pilots and non-flying diabetics alike, I think. Okay, you can find all the show notes for Jeremy's episode, which includes all the links mentioned, by heading over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. And don't forget, you can leave a comment for Jeremy directly on the page and find other recommended aviation resources, so go check out inspiredpilot.com. I really appreciate receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email, and you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Pinterest. If you do like the show, I'd be really grateful if you share it with one colleague, friend or a fellow AvGeek. And if you do have 5 minutes, then please leave a rating and review on iTunes with as many stars as possible, as this helps increase the show's exposure and therefore getting the journeys of our featured inspiring pilots in front of and inspiring more people, which is the whole mission of the podcast. Okay, that's it for now, and don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.